Imagine yourself in 1941. Archival footage shows a young, smiling woman. This is Rosemary Kennedy, sister of the future U.S. president, bright but difficult. Her father, in secret, decides on a new, fashionable procedure. The doctor picks up an instrument resembling an ice pick. Its creator, Walter Freeman, indeed got the idea from his own kitchen. He places it against her eye socket. A quiet tap of a hammer, thump, 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 piercing the thin bone. Within minutes, the 23-year-old woman is silenced forever, a shadow of her former self. The procedure that did this received a Nobel Prize. In this video, we won't just tell the story of a terrible medical error. We will delve into how brilliant minds, the best doctors of their time, created, popularized, and mass-produced a procedure that destroyed 50,000 lives. We'll understand why almost 60% of those operated on in the U.S. were women, often diagnosed with hysteria or excessive emotionality. Most importantly, we'll grasp why this could happen again, albeit in a different form. We'll see the genius who conceived this idea while observing a chimpanzee. We'll meet the showman who turned brain surgery into a roadside spectacle in his van, dubbed the Lobotomobile. And we'll discover why the Nobel Committee still hasn't revoked its most shameful decision. Lobotomy didn't emerge in a vacuum. It was born as a desperate hope for an escape from the hellish psychiatric asylums of the early 20th century. These were overcrowded wards, straitjackets, ice baths, and electroshock without anesthesia. Patients were plunged into insulin comas. They were given drugs that caused such severe convulsions that bones broke. These weren't hospitals. They were torture chambers with good intentions. Lobotomy seemed the only way out. And this way out was proposed by Portuguese neurologist Egas Moniz. He was no charlatan. By then, he had already been nominated for a Nobel Prize for another discovery. Moniz was not just a doctor, he was a politician, a diplomat, a man who signed the Treaty of Versailles on behalf of Portugal. He was an authority from the highest echelons, whose word was trusted implicitly. This is precisely why his idea, however radical, was taken seriously. It all began in 1935 in London at the Second International Congress of Neurology. American scientist Carlisle Jacobson presented his chimpanzee named Becky. Before the operation, if Becky failed a test, she would fly into a rage. But after a portion of her frontal lobes was removed, everything changed. She continued to make mistakes, but now she simply didn't care. Moniz, sitting in the audience, asked a historic question. Could this method be used to treat humans? It was a eureka moment, but with horrifying consequences. Moniz returned to Lisbon and designed an instrument called a leucotome, a hollow needle with a retractable wire loop. The surgeon would drill 2 holes in the patient's skull, insert the instrument, and, by rotating it, cut out pieces of white matter. Imagine the brain as a complex telephone exchange. Moniz wasn't trying to fix a broken apparatus. He simply took scissors and randomly severed bundles of wires, hoping that the troubling calls would stop. Sometimes they did. But along with them, all other connections were also severed. The initial reports were full of optimism. Patients became calmer. Moniz kept silent about the side effects. The idea was Portuguese, but it became a true epidemic in the hands of an American. Now, imagine for a second that you are a doctor in 1936. Before you is a patient in deepest depression who has already attempted suicide. There are no medications, therapy isn't helping. And then you hear about Moniz's method, risky but offering hope. At that time, the average stay in a psychiatric hospital wasn't months, but decades. Often, it was a one-way ticket. For doctors, the choice was between the patient's guaranteed social death within the hospital walls or a risky chance at a quiet life outside. It was a choice between bad and terrible. And at this moment, a man steps onto the stage for whom there were no doubts whatsoever. His name was Walter Freeman. The complete opposite of the aristocratic Moniz, Freeman was not a researcher, but a fanatic, a showman with a mission to make lobotomy fast, cheap, and as accessible as a tooth extraction. He believed that the soul resided not somewhere in the ether, but in the frontal lobes, and that he, Walter Freeman, could edit it by excising suffering. To mass-produce the operation, Drilling into the skull had to be eliminated. Freeman found the solution in his own kitchen. He picked up an ice pick and realized the brain could be accessed through the eye socket. The thin bone of the orbital cavity, that was his door. And the most terrifying part, Freeman was not a surgeon. His recklessness knew no bounds. It was like trying to fix a software bug in a computer by randomly waving a hot soldering iron across the motherboard. Or, as one critic put it, it was psychosurgery with a shotgun aim. Freeman got into his van, which he proudly called the Lobotomobile, and drove across the country. He performed up to 20 operations a day right in hospital wards, often in front of students and reporters. He turned it into a performance. Sometimes, for added effect, he would insert instruments into both eye sockets simultaneously. It was an assembly line. He described the process as if he were making a cocktail. I usually make 2 cuts. The movement should be vigorous. Imagine yourself on the operating table. You are conscious. You are given an electric shock to disorient you. Then you feel cold metal against your eye. A sharp tap of a hammer, pressure deep in your head, a scraping sound. And then, nothing. Emptiness. The emotions that tormented you are gone, but everything else is gone with them. The electroshock Freeman used as anesthesia was often a portable device simply plugged into an outlet. The patient was knocked out like a faulty household appliance before repair. The scale was monstrous. Over 50,000 lobotomies in the U.S. Freeman personally performed about 3,500, including one on a 12-year-old child. Indications for the operation: depression, schizophrenia, and sometimes just disobedience or excessive emotionality. One of his patients was Howard Dully. He was lobotomized at 12 at his stepmother's insistence. His symptoms: he didn't clean his room and sometimes talked out of turn. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Articles appeared in journals about catastrophic consequences: apathy, epilepsy, complete loss of personality. But Freeman was a PR genius. He showed the public only successful cases where unruly patients became quiet and obedient. He was selling convenience for relatives and staff, not a cure. And for the side effects, doctors invented a convenient term: frontal lobe syndrome. It sounded scientific and concealed the truth. A person turned into a vegetable, but in their chart it was recorded as a syndrome. Freeman created a perfect procedure. Its victims couldn't complain. They simply fell silent. But one day he made a mistake. He operated on a young woman whose family was too influential to be silenced. You already know her name: Rosemary Kennedy. The Kennedy family in the 1940s America was synonymous with success, money, power, boundless political ambition. Rosemary, with her learning difficulties and mood swings, didn't fit this ideal facade. Her father, Joseph Kennedy, saw her as a threat to his son's future. But she wasn't insane. In 1938, she and her sister were presented to the British royal court. She perfectly executed a complex curtsy before King George VI. This was a young woman who simply didn't meet her father's impossibly high standards. Joseph Kennedy made the decision for the lobotomy in secret. Neither his wife nor his other children knew anything. He heard about Freeman's miracle procedure and decided to fix his daughter. This was not a medical consultation, but a willful decision to eliminate a problem. His primary fear was not so much her behavior as her uncontrolled sexuality. He was terrified that she might become pregnant out of wedlock, creating a scandal that would ruin John's and Robert's political ambitions. For him, lobotomy was a form of personality sterilization. Freeman and his assistant, James Watts, performed the operation while Rosemary was conscious. They asked her to sing songs and tell stories. When her speech became incoherent, Freeman stopped. It was the point of no return. Watts later recalled with horror, "We put the instrument in, and she was singing 'God Bless America.' We moved it, and she began to speak incoherently. We stopped. That was the end. It wiped her out." Rosemary did not get better. She regressed to the level of a 2-year-old child. She couldn't walk, talk, or recognize her family. The Kennedy family hid her in a private clinic, effectively erasing her from their lives for 20 years. The official story was that she was mentally retarded and working as a teacher somewhere in the Midwest. Lies covered the tragedy. The truth only emerged in 1987, 46 years after the operation, when her sister Eunice wrote an article about it. For almost half a century, the family maintained this facade. On the scale of historical responsibility, where does Joseph Kennedy's decision lie? Was it a barbaric act of egoism to protect the family's reputation? Or a tragic mistake by a father who in 1941 genuinely believed he was saving his daughter? The truth is likely somewhere in the middle, and that makes it even more terrifying. In that era, similar decisions were made everywhere. Families got rid of inconvenient relatives. The Kennedy tragedy was not an exception, but simply the most famous of thousands of similar stories hidden behind closed doors. Rosemary's tragedy, once it became known, changed the family. Her sister, Eunice Kennedy Shriver, founded the Special Olympics, dedicating her life to helping people with developmental disabilities. Eunice herself said, "Rosemary was not a tragedy, but an inspiration." She made us realize how much we can do for those whom society rejects. This shows how something bright can emerge from the darkest story, but the price was unimaginably high. But the end of lobotomy did not come from a courtroom. It came from a chemical laboratory in the form of a small pill. In the early 1950s, the world saw chlorpromazine, the first effective antipsychotic. It was a true miracle. A pill could do what a knife could not, calm the symptoms of psychosis without destroying the personality. The most amazing thing about its origin is that no one was looking for a cure for madness. Chlorpromazine was developed by a French company as a sedative for patients before anesthesia. Its effect on the psyche was discovered almost by accident. It was a lucky mistake that changed everything. The difference was colossal. Lobotomy was irreversible, unpredictable, and destructive. The dose of an antipsychotic could be adjusted. Its effect could be reversed. It targeted brain chemistry, not its crude structure. Lobotomy was like trying to fix a watch with a sledgehammer. Chlorpromazine became the first drop of oil, a delicate instrument that allowed furiously spinning gears to slow down without breaking the entire mechanism. Demand for Freeman's operations began to plummet. Freeman defended his method to the very end, calling medications chemical lobotomy. But as time had passed, in 1967, he performed his last operation. The patient died of a brain hemorrhage. Freeman was finally forbidden to operate. He died without ever admitting he was wrong. In his final years, he continued to travel the country in his lobotomobile, but no longer for operations. He photographed his former patients, desperately trying to gather evidence of success. He clung to his legacy even as it crumbled before his eyes. This chemical revolution had one enormous consequence. Thanks to medications, hundreds of thousands of patients were able to leave psychiatric hospitals. In the U.S., in 1955, there were approximately 560,000 people in state psychiatric hospitals. By the mid-90s, thanks to antipsychotics, that number had fallen to 70,000. An entire city of patients was freed. The era of gigantic, isolated houses of sorrow came to an end. Lobotomy died. But one very uncomfortable question remained. Why was Egas Moniz awarded the Nobel Prize in 1949 when the scale of the disaster was already evident? The committee evaluated his work based on reports from the 1930s, before Walter Freeman turned it into a bloody spectacle. Against the backdrop of no alternatives, it truly seemed like a breakthrough. They were recognizing a bold idea, not its monstrous implementation. Moreover, Moniz himself nominated for the prize several times. The Nobel Committee at the time was heavily influenced by authorities. They rewarded reputation and boldness more than results. Since the 1950s, movements have regularly emerged demanding the prize be revoked. The committee refuses, stating that it cannot judge the past by modern standards. This raises a very uncomfortable question about historical responsibility in science. In the Nobel Museum in Stockholm itself, the exhibition dedicated to Moniz is one of the most controversial. They do not hide the debate. Alongside the description of his achievement, there is information about the devastating consequences. This is an acknowledgement of error, albeit without a formal revocation of the prize. But the very idea of influencing the brain to treat mental disorders did not die. It evolved. Today, there is deep brain stimulation, or DBS, for treating Parkinson's disease or severe depression. These are highly precise, reversible, and data-driven technologies. If lobotomy was a shotgun blast in the dark at a complex mechanism, then DBS is the work of a neurosurgeon sniper who, using GPS navigation, disables a single faulty wire without affecting the others. The story of lobotomy is a warning about the dangerous combination of patient desperation and the arrogance of innovators like Freeman. When society faces a complex problem, there is always the temptation to believe in a simple, radical solution. This is called Maslow's hammer effect. If all you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. For Moniz and Freeman, lobotomy became that hammer, and patients with the most diverse problems, from schizophrenia to simple disobedience, became the nails that needed to be hammered in. What lobotomies exist today? Not in medicine, but in other spheres. What simple and quick solutions for complex social, personal, or political problems are offered to us every day? History teaches that with every such proposal, it is worth looking more closely. To avoid falling into such a trap, it is enough to remember 3 lessons etched into the ruins of this history. First, skepticism toward miracle solutions. If something sounds too simple and good to be true, it probably isn't, especially in medicine. Second, the main principle is do no harm. The loss of personality is not a side effect. It is the destruction of the patient. And third, informed consent is everything. The patient and their family must know all the risks and all the alternatives. Secret decisions, as in the Kennedy case, lead to tragedy. It was horrors like lobotomy and Nazi experiments that led to the creation of the Nuremberg Code in 1947. In it, the principle of voluntary patient consent was first enshrined as an absolute law for the entire civilized world. This document is written in the blood of victims. The story of lobotomy is not just a medical curiosity. It is a mirror reflecting society's fears and hopes, and the main question remains open. What, at its core, was this procedure? A last desperate attempt to help people in dark times when there were simply no other options? Or the greatest manifestation of medical arrogance, where a doctor puts himself in the place of God? Write just one word in the comments that you think best describes this story: help or arrogance. Let's see which one prevails.